Hi, guys. Today we'll talk about such an interesting topic as Christianity and democracy and also pluralism. And we'll do so with John Inazu, who is the professor at Washington University School of Law. So, John, thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. It's good to be with you.
Yeah, thank you. So, I would like to start that way before discussing the things about religion and pluralism. Do you believe in God and why?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I do believe in God. I'm a Christian, and I think the Christian story makes the most sense for the world. And I have confidence that it is the way that we are supposed to live our lives. So I try to organize my life around that priority in what I do with my time and my money and my efforts.
Yeah, and you're a law and religion professor, right?
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, and so why have you chosen such an interesting combination? Why didn't you decide to go into law or only into religion, but you decide to combine these things?
Sure. So I practiced law for 5 years before I got into teaching. And then when I went back to school to work on a PhD, my focus was on the US First Amendment and particularly the right of assembly, which is the rights of groups to gather and to protest, but also to be distinctive as groups. And that led me into the religion dimension of things because, among other things, religious groups and churches also like to meet and to gather. And so for me, starting with the law, moving through the right of assembly into religion, that formed the nexus of the two. And since then, I've spent a lot of time both teaching and writing at the intersection of law and religion to include some work in theology, some work in constitutional theory, but I've always been very fascinated by the intersection of the two.
Yeah, and as considering the law and legal system, I have one question that really interests me because I see kind of correlation there. I see that Christian countries are more likely to be democratic, as I see. Yeah, and in this context, I would like to ask how much do the current legal system, I mean, the laws and legal principles in Western countries, come from Christian morality? How much did Christian morality and Christian view on this world's impacts on forming and on shaping the current laws in Western countries, including the United States?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think at the highest level, it would be impossible to talk about the history of Western jurisprudence and political theory without the impact of Christianity. So the early church fathers responding to the writings and activities of the New Testament, think about Augustine and others in the scholastic era, Aquinas and other writers who really formed the basis of, I mean, at this point, pre-democratic, obviously, but the infusion of Christian values and norms, everything from representation to deliberation to forgiveness and these kinds of concepts that permeate much of Western political thought, and then into democratic practices. So in the United States, for example, when the early US context is responding to the Constitution and democratic practices that were extant at the time in England, and then building, of course, on their own, including the novel arrangement of both the free exercise of religion and the anti-establishment principles, the prototype of early democratic practices. These are all within the basket and the context of really by that point centuries of Christian jurisprudence and political thought. Now, I think importantly in the U.S. context, the framing founders of the Constitution and the First Amendment were also responding at the time to Enlightenment thought and other non-Christian influences. And so the story of the United States is a complicated one. It's both premised on a lot of earlier Western and Christian jurisprudential moves, and also combining those with the Enlightenment. And so we have in today's modern context, a really interesting and important combination of those two and many other influences.
Yeah, and I absolutely agree because, as I mentioned, I see kind of correlation here. Like Christian countries are more likely to be democratic, but I think not only because they are Christian countries, but because of this legal system is influenced by the Christian morality. And if we look, for example, even at Asia, for example, Japan is liberal country, liberal democracy, but even Japanese legal system was formed after the World War II, right? And yeah, it was the influence of the Western countries.
Sure. And Japan itself is, of course, a unique case because of the influence of the United States in particular after the Second World War. But when you look at something like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights from the United Nations, and really a lot of constitution building that transpired in the second half of the 20th century and beyond, many of these provisions are based on US and other democratic practices, which are then in turn rooted in this earlier Christian history. So when you think about, why is it important, for example, that we have religious freedom, or why is it important that we have a right to gather and to protest against the government, even if we're not in control, even if we're not the majority. These trace back to deeply Christian practices centuries before we even were talking about democracies.
Yeah, and by the way, you mentioned the protests, right? And according to Christian morality, what should Christians do, for example, in the situation when they are in dictatorship? Should we protest, and do we have rights to use violence if we are violated? Our rights are violated. So, what does the Christian morality says about it? Because I just want to make a small remark because I'm ethnically Georgian, yeah, but I'm believer Christian, yeah. But to make this interview more interesting, I will be as skeptical as possible. Yeah, yeah. But I was born in Russia, and in this country we had, I mean, they had a dictatorship, and I think without using the violence in that case, nothing is achievable. So what does this question is really personal for me. What does Christian morality say about it? Do we have the right to defend our freedom? How should freedom be secured in this case?
Yeah, this is such an important set of questions. And of course, Christian jurists and Christian theologians have debated these questions for centuries. There's certainly tension points with even within the New Testament. When the Apostle Paul talks about submitting to the government in Romans 13, but also later in the book of Acts when the apostles say we've got to obey God and not man. So what does it mean at the intersection of obeying God and human authorities on the one hand, or sorry, obeying God on the one hand and obeying man and human authorities on the other hand? And what does it look like to obey structures of government, which many Christian theologians would say God has ordained, and at the same time, when those structures and those institutions become corrupt or evil, at what point can you as a Christian resist even up to the use of violence? So Augustine talks about this when he gestures at the start of what becomes the just war tradition. At some point, on behalf of someone else, you can intervene with the use of force or violence. Augustine famously also justified that for the use of, in some cases, disciplining heretics, which has since become very controversial and mostly disclaimed. But throughout the Christian tradition, you've got these really important and deep and powerful arguments about when and whether Christians can engage in the use of force or even violence when there is an oppressive rule above them or on behalf of other people who are being oppressed, on behalf of other countries that are facing injustice. And of course, the real challenge here is at a 30,000 foot view, if God is good and God is peace, then what do you do with the reality of evil in the world? And how do you respond to evil when it might require your own use of something that is not fully good or not fully peaceful, that being force or violence. And the strands of Christianity that make arguments in favor of sort of an absolute pacifism. This would be in the Anabaptist or Mennonite tradition that say you can never use violence. Violence comes to you, you sit there, you pray, you resist nonviolently, and you hope that God delivers you. All the way to the other extreme where Christian states have said we can actually use force to compel others toward Christianity. And then along this spectrum, you've got, uh, you know, centuries of debate over the extent to which one may participate in this sort of activity.
Yeah, and yeah, to continue these debates, I'd like to ask one more question. As you said, that we have a kind of situation when evil comes here to us, and we have to defend ourselves. So, but in the Bible, it's written that we even should love our enemies, right? And do we have like other quotes in the Bible that say that evil comes to your house? You have the right to protect you, even using the force.
Well, that's a good question. I suppose it's what context you're looking at. I mean, certainly in the Old Testament, you've got lots of examples of the Israelites using armies and using force, either to protect themselves or sometimes at the command of God to go and attack other people. There's a debate about whether Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount is talking about loving your enemies, being peacemakers, resisting, turning the other cheek, and these sorts of things. Does this apply only on an individual basis, or does it apply in all social contexts? And the stronger readings of Matthew 5 and other parts of the New Testament would say you just have to uh, resist peacefully, but not forcefully. And there are no real commands in scripture that say you can use force especially to defend yourself. I think there in the Christian tradition, there are stronger arguments about using force to defend other people. But at the end of the day, the self-interested force is the hardest case to make.
Yeah, okay. And going back to that legal track, yeah, we mentioned that legal system and laws based on Christian ideas like pushing toward the democracy. And by the way, uh, can stable democratic institution exist without the Christianity? And do we have examples of successful liberal democracies who are not Christian?
Well, I think you're seeing a number of countries, both in the European context and arguably in the North American context too, where the influence of Christianity is on the decline. And so, if you want to call those countries post-Christian in some sense, there is the continued practices of democracy within some of those countries, especially those that have confronted the challenge of pluralism, meaning a lot of differences in both religious and other beliefs, and how do we live together in societies that have these deep differences among the people. I think that the question for me, which remains, I think, to be determined, is to what extent can these pluralistic societies continue on across all of their disagreement without any kind of common tether? So, in political examples where the majority of the country may no longer be Christian, and people perhaps rightly say we don't want to be governed by Christianity because there are so many people here who are not Christians. The question becomes what fills that vacuum? What becomes the common narrative or the common good for an entire country? And in particular, how do you appeal to moving forward once you inevitably start to hurt each other? So something like forgiveness, for example, which strikes me as a deeply Christian concept, is the narrative of forgiveness possible at a broad and comprehensive social level without the framework of Christianity? And I think that's a really important and really interesting open question that we do not yet know the answer to.
Yeah. By the way, you mentioned this vacuum that we get when we say no to Christianity and to all the religions. And I would like to ask you one thing, come from my personal experience. When I talk to my European friends, they often say that, as they say, they are afraid of Islamization of Europe. Yeah, and when I say to them that if you are afraid of it, you have to provide something instead, right? So, and because as I think it's part of human nature that we are seeking for God, that we're seeking for something higher and something spiritual. But they say that no, we just need to say no to all the religions because religions are the main problem in the world that divides us. So I would like to ask you, how do you think could people say no to all the religions, not only Christianity? Could people say no to the idea of God?
Well, I mean, empirically, we certainly have lots of people today who reach that conclusion and who would profess themselves to be atheists and have no belief in any higher power. It makes it more challenging to talk about again what that common narrative is across different beliefs if there's not even sort of a shared appeal to transcendence. But it's certainly possible. And I think the important flip side of this is both from Christian theology and jurisprudence through the Reformation, but also from the Catholics post Vatican II, and then also Enlightenment sources like Locke and others. We've reached a pretty firm consensus that you can't coerce religious belief, right? You can encourage religious practices, but at the end of the day, nobody's going to be forced into a kind of faith. You have to come at that on your own. And so I think the best conditions uh, when you have the fact of pluralism and where some people believe and some don't, you want to have a sort of procedural liberalism, which could be quite minimal, but supporting democratic practices, supporting the ability both to explore your own understanding of faith or non-faith, and to minimize the government's exertion of its own orthodoxies or ideologies. And that's when the American context in the US First Amendment, this is the tension between the free exercise of religion and the anti-establishment principle, and then how you play that out in specific cases becomes where all of the modern constitutional action is.
And speaking about American context, are there tensions between people of different religious groups? What's the situation in the United States? Because I, as European, don't really know about the situation in the United States, and so I would like to hear it from you. Yeah.
Sure. So, I mean, I guess starting with the historical angle, there have always been tensions, and one of the big success stories of the US constitutional experiment is the ability of people of different faiths to figure out how to live with very deep differences. So at the founding of the United States, when you had mostly white Protestants in control, the denominational differences between Protestants at the time were massive, and you had Anglicans and Congregationalists and Baptists all fighting with one another, and in some parts of the world killing each other. And in the U.S. context, we figured out a way to make that work and to resolve differences peacefully. And then since then, you could think of the story of American religious freedom as the ever successive expansion of different religious groups, some coming from the outside as you've had a greater infusion of Catholics, and today more Muslims in the United States on the one hand, some new religions that emerge in the US context, like Christian Science and Mormonism and others, and then figuring out how to make all of those faiths work together. It's not perfect. There are still tensions today. There are tensions between conservative Christians and conservative Muslims, for example. There are tensions between non-believers and people of faith, and our courts are continue to work those out. But part of the success story of the American experiment is we don't kill each other generally over religious differences. And in most ordinary contexts, whether it's working in a hospital or going to school together, you've got people of many different faiths who come together to cooperate. And this is actually it's a stunning achievement of I think the American experiment, where In other parts of the world, you don't see this. You see religiously segregated populations, and sometimes you see people of one faith who won't actually go to help people of a different faith. And by and large, that's not the case in the United States.
Yeah, by the way, speaking about the communication between representatives of different religions, I would like to say that you published a book about confident pluralism, right? So could you please explain to our viewers what does confident pluralism mean, and what is the difference, for example, between confidence and unconfident pluralism? So what
Sure.
does this term mean? Yeah.
Yeah, so a lot of this relates to the discussion we've already been having, but the argument that I set out in confident pluralism is that we start with the reality of very deep differences in our society over things that matter, and differences that are not going away. So we have to figure out, how do we live with these differences when we disagree about what is the nature of a human being? Is there a God? And if so, what is God like? What happens when you die? These are massive questions, and there are strong disagreements in this country over the answers to those questions. So the argument that I make in confident pluralism is, one, we ought to start with a kind of confidence in our own beliefs. That doesn't mean an arrogance or even a certainty, but it means confident enough to understand what you believe and to tell other people, sort of as I did as we started this conversation today, that I order my life and these are my priorities because of my belief in this particular faith tradition. And then the pluralism part of it is recognizing that other people will go about their own lives quite differently. And then we have to figure out ways to engage with each other across those differences. So in confident pluralism, I set out a framework for both constitutional provisions that strengthen protections for difference and allow people to dissent and have different views, and then a kind of civic engagement or set of civic practices that could let us come together. How can we listen well? How can we empathize? How can we be somewhat humble in our own beliefs so that we can encourage dialogue across the differences that we encounter?
Yeah, and what do you think, in your opinion, how can we achieve this confident pluralism and this dialogue between religions when each religion asks for like ultimate and exclusive faithfulness to their own gods? For example, if we are talking about Christianity, Jesus writes. If we are talking about Muslims, it's Allah, and it asks for spreading this religion too. Yeah. So, how can we achieve pluralism and real understanding of positions of other people in these terms if we strongly follow the convictions of our books, Bible, Quran, or I don't know, another? Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I think a huge premise here is that we start with the presumption of persuasion over coercion, that we're going to be in sometimes lifelong relationships with other people who believe differently. And our goal, I mean, if you believe this is true, you obviously want other people to see it and come to understand it as well. But you do that through persuasion and discussion and relationship, not force or control. And if everybody can come to the table with that perspective, that's how you can actually do democracy in a diverse society. It's not everybody wants that perspective, but if you can get a critical mass of people to believe in that, then it might be possible to pursue that, and that's an important part of it. And then a kind of humility that recognizes, you know what, I might not have all of the answers, and that leads to a curiosity. I want to learn from other people. Sometimes I want to learn from other people even to strengthen my own beliefs about what I think. And that is the activity of dialogue in democracy.
Yeah, and you said that the idea of learning something different is very important for establishing such kind of pluralism. But for example, if people are strongly convinced that their religion is true, for example, Christians, right? And in Bible we have such quote that says, "Be aware of." And be afraid of false prophets. So it means that it's kind of restricts this dialogue between the representatives of different religion. I mean, these representatives who want to take you in different direction. So how can we avoid such misunderstanding, and how can we establish the dialogue in that case?
So two things. First of all, fundamental to all of this is the freedom to speak and act on your actual beliefs. So we have to have the space to say not only what we believe is true, but also the ability to say somebody else's belief is false or wrong. And that's part of the equation, is that we have to be able to say that and be able to have real differences, including the differences that say what you believe is wrong and false. I think a corollary here, though, is that we can also find lots of ways where we can partner with other people who have deep, deep differences. So we might disagree about the nature of God, but we can still work together to help people in need, or we can still partner at a hospital or in a community. And to find and discover the common ground that we have as human beings is not to say the beliefs don't matter. It's not to say that some people are wrong or right, but it is to say, despite those differences, we can still come together and do lots of ordinary life together.
Yeah, and just to clarify, does your idea of confident pluralism mean paying respect to the different religions themselves and these thoughts, or paying respect to people who are representatives of these religion or ideas?
No, that's a great distinction, and I'm talking about learning to respect the people, not necessarily respecting all ideas. So for Christians, for example, everybody is created in the image of God. Everybody is an image bearer. That means that I've got something to learn from every human being I encounter. It doesn't mean that all of the ideas out there are good and fine. In fact, some of the ideas out there are deeply harmful and wrong and should be corrected. But we can distinguish between people and the ideas they hold.
Yeah, and one of my last questions. There are people who say that their ideas and their ideology are based on holy books, texts, Bible or Quran as well. And they say that violence is acceptable to spread the religion. For example, if we are talking about Christianity, we can mention the Crusades. If we're talking about Quran, we can mention, for example, idea of jihad. So, in this context and in the context of confident pluralism, what should we do with? How should we deal with such people? Should we say that okay, it's kind of democratic value to express your opinion, or we should treat them differently? What do you think?
Well, I think especially in a context like the United States, we should and do allow for all kinds of opinions to be voiced, but you can't act on those opinions. So the religious believer who would actually say, we are going to engage in violence, for example, a liberal democratic society is going to say, no, you can't do that. So at some point, the government is going to trump and limit the activities and the practices of certain religious groups. And that's true of any faith that wants to say, I'm not going to follow your rules. I'm going to engage instead through violence and coercion. And at that point, the state properly says you can't do that here.
Yeah, and my last question. So we mentioned the effective dialogue between the representatives of different religions, and we've discussed how to establish such kind of dialogue. And I'd like to ask you how to avoid misunderstanding, because many Christians often try to convert even converts the
Right,
representatives,
right.
yeah, of other religions, but they're doing this not because they want to kind of defeat their opponent. They're doing it because as they say, they love them, and they say that how should I hate you to believe that Jesus is way, and not to tell you about it. So how can we build this process of communication in effective way, and how to avoid such kind of misunderstanding? Are there kind of practices for it? How should this dialogue be built in these terms of like personal communication?
Yeah, so I think it's perfectly fine to start with a posture of evangelism, right? A desire to share your faith with other people and a hope that they come to believe and understand it to be true. But what we should avoid, and Christians should avoid, is being instrumental about it, as if to say, this person is my project and my sole reason for engaging in this relationship is to convert or to persuade. When in fact, most people today want to know, do you care about me as a human being? Do you take my intelligence and my beliefs seriously? Are you willing to entertain my own questions and doubts for you? And I think when people encounter relationships with other people and say, I'm going to take this relationship seriously, you can still talk about, wanting to persuade or wanting to convert somebody, but you're giving them a respect about their beliefs and their dignity as a human being, which is quite different than just saying, you're my project and I'm going to convert you.
Yeah, so we're running out for time, so probably we have to finish. John, do you want to say something to our viewers? Like.
Yeah, I just said thanks for the opportunity to join you. It's been a great conversation talking to you, and I hope that the rest of the project and your exploration goes well.
So, thank you, viewers, for viewing these videos, and thank you, John, for coming. I think it was very different and important conversation, especially if we're talking about current situation in the world. So, thank you, John, for coming, and please subscribe and share this video. Bye.
Take care.